like to call up first Joe Donohue. He is the Deputy Director at the Election Law Enforcement Commission. He's been there for about 2 years. But if you know Joe from his prior life, he was at the Star-Ledger covering, he was at the State House Bureau covering government and politics like no one else. His stories always put the right spotlight on the practice of pay-to-play, what were candidates doing, what were our government officials doing. He did amazing research reports every year where he would look at every state authority, their contracts, and then were they giving money. He would cross-reference it. I'm sure he'll go into a little bit more about what he found and like what his tricks of the trade were. But Joe, you can take a seat. We also have asked Joe Malanconico, if you want to come up. He is the editor of Patterson Press. Prior to joining us, he had a distinguished career at both the Star-Ledger and the Daily Record. This past June, he received 2 awards from the New Jersey chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists for his coverage of Patterson. I think one of them was Best Online Public Service. And finally, Nick Acacella. He is the editor of PolitiFacts. It's a weekly must-read for anyone who's involved in New Jersey government and politics. I didn't know this. I knew you loved sports, but you're a sports writer by trade.
Yes,
you wrote several
indeed.
books on baseball. So he was well prepared to cover the politics of New Jersey, the players, and the game. And I found this quote in the New York Times about Nick. It said, Mr. Acacella's contribution to the political culture of the state are his reports from the little battlefields that don't always make the big daily newspapers. So we're really honored to have all these guests. I've asked each of them to offer some introductory remarks, and then so please hold questions, and then we're going to turn it over to Q&A, and our chairman, Harry Pizicki, will serve as moderator when we get there. So gentlemen, I'll let you decide who goes first.
Joe, you were announced first.
All right.
I have 2 Joes. This is going to be fun. And refer to
Well, you can use that mic.
Joe Wright and Joe Farr. No.
Thanks, Heather.
Oh, and all of you were given, and you can raise your hand if you didn't have it, a handout on how to cover local elections. I told them they can feel free to reference it for their remarks. It was a PowerPoint presentation you can use for after today to use ELEC's website.
I don't know how to live up to that introduction, but I'll try. Yeah, what I wanted to provide was sort of a hybrid, because I wanted to tell you about what resources, especially, I think the patch reporters know. I recently sent out an email to patch reporters. I was just sitting here one day, and it's because I was in the news business so long. I said, man, if I'm a patch reporter, my agency, the Election Law Enforcement Commission, is just like a gold mine of information in terms of the information about local officials, school board members, freeholders, county executives, assembly members. So I just thought I would reach out and just alert people at Patch as everybody's gearing up for the fall elections, just like, look, here's what's available, and just, if you need information, call me or just check the website. So I do see Lee coming in, by the way. I'm not deep into it, Heather, if you want to go with Lee first.
No, you start.
Okay, all right. So I just wanted to, especially for the people that aren't with Patch, I want to reiterate what is available at the Election Law Enforcement Commission, because as a reporter myself, I used it for over 20 years, and that's how I built up the background and expertise that I used to actually get a job there. Literally, one of my first stories in the 1980s was about how a bunch of law firms that worked for Atlantic City casinos were passing donations to a well-known senator that served with Bill Schluter and had a hot temper. I won't name his name. But he was getting all these donations from casino law firms because casinos are banned for making donations. So it was pretty clear that the casinos were making their influence felt indirectly. But that literally was the first campaign finance story I ever wrote about. And that led to a long career trying to document where people in politics got their dough and then ultimately, for me, actually working at the agency that oversees campaign finance in the state. So at the agency, which is based in Trenton, we have reports that are filed by all the candidates. Each candidate that runs in New Jersey has to file a report 29 days, 11 days, and 20 days after the election, and both for the primary and general, if they run in both. And so you can get, on our website, you can get facsimiles of the reports, and eventually you get the data actually in a searchable database. So there's a lag time with that, and it's not real time, so you can't get it in time for the elections. About those campaigns, and that applies to legislators and local officials, and by local I'll include county, school board members, fire commissioners. You also have, unfortunately, since most campaigns are local, and unfortunately people either intentionally or unintentionally violate our laws. So we also issue a lot of fines against candidates and both people who won office and didn't. Each month, twice a month, we'll send out a notice that there are new fines against these candidates, or proposed fines, proposed penalties against people who violate the law. So that while it's not flattering, that's another source of news and information about local officials that you check, and you can search by town. You could just go in there and search Hoboken or Atlantic City or Collingswood, whichever town. We also have a requirement under the law that all contractors with more than 50,000, all public contractors with more than 50,000 in contracts statewide have to file with us every year an annual report that shows what contracts they have and then what donations they've made throughout the state. So it's a really convenient way to just see, all right, I'm in Essex County, I'm in Camden County, I'm in Sussex County, who's given? And you can go in there and search by location and search by contractor. And it's a really good, I think, almost underused tool that we have. Sometimes I wish, it's a newer part of our website. I wish the rest of it operated like this. But it's another great resource to track the activity of contractors. And then finally, we have a lot of information about lobbyists and their fees. And that can be of interest because a lot of municipalities and authorities and other local entities and county entities hire lobbyists. And while the governor has railed against it, and it has definitely dropped down, it's not as high as it was in the past. Colleges do it, like community colleges. I mean, it's a source of information that might be, potential story ideas. I know when we came out with the annual lobbying reports, these come out every February, where it lists who hires lobbyists. These reports list who hired the lobbyists and how much they got. So, you can just go through the list and you'll see different towns like Newark and other towns that hire lobbyists. So that's just what our agency offers. And like I said, I think it's definitely the kind of thing where you should check it regularly. You can get on our mailing list, and that will send you press releases. If you are covering the legislative race, I'll point out that we do a report when the 29-day, 11-day, and 20-day post reports come out. We'll be doing a statewide report, so you can list, or you'll see a list of the donations raised by each of the legislative candidates, and then you'll be able to check each district. Like that's where Pat was alluding to the battleground districts, like the 14th and the 1st and the 2nd and the 36th in Bergen County. All the big bucks, what typically happens is they raise millions and millions of dollars each campaign, and probably 2/3 of that winds up in about 5 to 10 districts, because those are the districts that could swing either way. There's swing districts. And the 14th has been the place with the narrowest margins, according to a study done by Senator Schluter, who's sitting in this room. Really good study he gave to the redistricting committee. So I think the average re-election margin was about 2.4% there. So those reports come out, and in the middle of the campaign around mid-October, we'll also be putting an analysis of the state parties and legislative leadership PACs, what donations they've raised and who they're giving money to. And again, it helps figure out what the target districts are. You know, there's always potential news there. Now, Heather did such a good job with this presentation that I don't have to say too much. But I just wanted to add a few things to what she had there. One thing to keep in mind if you're tracking a campaign is typically, especially in bigger races, the money comes later. Like when you had one of the great examples of this was 2002 Bergen County Democratic County Executive, Dennis McNerney. He won with a deluge of money he got from Democrats around the state. He beat Hank McNamara, a longtime senator, again, a former colleague of Bill Schluter's. And Hank just got bombarded. It was literally like a sneak attack at the end. They killed him with about $2 million in cash the last 5 or 6 days of the campaign. That's extreme, but typically they like to hold their cards as close as they can. I mean, they got to do ad buys and all that, and buy direct mail. But they'll try to conceal. In the earlier reports, you usually don't see as much as you do the later reports, and sometimes even some of the best stuff is in the report after the election. So just keep that in mind. Another thing to keep in mind is that in the days immediately before the election, candidates have to put out, under our law, 48-hour notices. So within 48 hours of receiving a donation or they make an expenditure, they have to send us a notice of that, and we put it up on our website. So you can actually check our website every day. About 12 days out from the campaign, this starts. It's on our website. You can check every day. I used to literally check them every day when I was at the Ledger covering the legislative races. And all kinds of interesting stuff pops up there, and you get it quicker. I mean, one thing to look for too is there's a growing pattern around the state, which we've talked about as an agency, and is done to some extent to get around contribution limits and get around pay-to-play restrictions that are on contractors. A lot of candidates set up sort of pseudo special interest PACs. They're not really special interest PACs, but they sound like it. Like, you know, and they're all over the state. I mean, they've been used to steer money into campaigns. And what typically happens is friends of that candidate will set up the PAC, and he won't be directly involved with it, or she won't be directly involved with it. But, you know, it's clearly set up by supporters of that candidate. And there's a lot of examples. I mean, I'll mention this one because Heather and Harry put a spotlight on it, and it's, you know, it's very public. But Empower Newark was set up by friends of Cory Booker, and that funnels money into, you know, a lot of the things he cares about, and that, you know, they raised issues about our contractors, newer contractors, giving money there where, you know, they really shouldn't be, and, you know, it just raises questions. So you should look for PACs that are close to the candidate, that sort of float around the candidate. You know, Heather in her presentation pointed out, look for money from contractors, look for money from local employees. That can really be big in the kind of races you people cover, because typically mayors and county executives especially get lots of money from the local employees. I mean, to the point where you sometimes wonder if their jobs are dependent on them kicking back with a donation. But, you've seen this in the past. And there's some major examples of it. like when Jim Florio first ran for governor, he got all this money from Camden County employees, 300,000 when he ran in '89. Brett Schundler got a ton of money when he ran for governor from Jersey City employees. But I mean, definitely with municipal officials, you have to look for that, and it can be pretty substantial. I mean, some local officials, the bulk of their money comes from local employees, and that's a great story if you can uncover that pattern. So that's definitely something to keep an eye on. Another thing too is just interesting is that sometimes family members give, and you know, that can be interesting too. Just sort of throw in a general story about who's giving. You know, Heather already mentioned about trying to get the top 10. You know, really anything that looks unusual or looks interesting, you know, I would jump on. And at one point, look at the expenses too, because they can be funny or interesting. With a lot of local races, a lot of their money is going to be spent on direct mail. But you know, like one candidate, I saw a legislative candidate once say he bought like 8 cases of champagne. This is champagne. And sometimes they get very specific. Other times they're a little too big. I've seen candidates hire private detectives. I've seen candidates pay themselves for offices they rent from themselves. So there can be really interesting stuff there, some interesting grist. And also don't forget local ballot questions, because you can have unlimited contributions. If someone's active in seeking the passage or opposing a local ballot question, there's no donation limit. So like when there were plans for possible private takeover of Trenton's water supply, the water company down there spent $1 million on that campaign. And that was a big issue. It was a big, in some ways it was bigger than the local election. I mean, those are some things I would say. And then I'll throw a few. Heather wanted me to put my reporter hat on a little bit, which I got to be careful about. But I'll just give you a few tips in terms of interviewing. She talked about interviewing. And one thing I found is you don't start out like Elliot Ness and start banging him over the head right off the bat. It was funny because I had a few people call me Columbo, because what I always did was I always would come back at almost the last question would be the zinger, like after people are sort of calm and you know their guard is down a little bit, and I didn't do it intentionally, but it was just my interviewing style. But if you get people's backs up right away, I mean, it's going to be a lot harder to get information out of them. You know, just chat. I mean, just small talk. Try to find out hobbies and just find out a little bit personally about the candidate. You know, definitely use your tape recorder, because while a politician might lie to you, the recorder doesn't. So you want that as backup, because you know, more and more, if you come out with a story that really embarrasses a politician, they're going to deny it. They're going to challenge it. So you better be ready to back it up. You better have that, you know, that record there in case you have to, you know, stand firm. And be prepared. I always was a big believer in over-preparing for interviews and everything else. And it might waste a little time, but I think in the end you come up with better results. I mean, I wouldn't walk into an interview without at least 10 good questions. And, you know, I just think it's always worth it to try to, you know, prepare carefully. And also be professional. Like, even if some people will get mad and even lash out at you or, you know, be unprofessional in other ways, that doesn't mean you should be. You know, keep your cool when you're dealing with local officials. Remember, if they make threats, I mean, I've had people make death threats, not politicians. But, you know, you got to be professional, because ultimately that just serves you the best. So I'll leave you with that.
All right, hi. So I guess I'm supposed to talk about the process of pinning down candidates, getting them to say what they really mean, in that whole process. And I guess, to really part of what Pat had said, I mean, we're really the only game in town, as hyper-local editors and reporters. I mean, you know, the Ledger's not covering the mayoral race anymore, you know. The local papers really are so thinly staffed, they're giving short shrift to the local races anymore. So we've got, you know, almost a solemn duty to do a good job in a sense, you know. And when it comes down to, I mean, and you know, I had just impressed. I know that one of the big, when we're doing hyper-local, one of the big things is, okay, you got to post all those local event kind of things, and those are time-consuming. And sometimes it's difficult to make time for covering an election the right way, you know. But I mean, if it's a choice between posting 3 recreation department, you know, event items, or spending 3 hours doing the research you need to do a good interview, you know, to me it should be a no-brainer at this point. I mean, people aren't going to miss, they're going to find out about the VFW's, you know, pasta night, you know, but they're not going to find out where the mayoral candidate really stands unless one of us gets him or her to say that. And Joe talked about doing your homework, and really that's the most important. If you're going to cover an election, if you're not doing your homework, if I'm not doing it, in my experience, when I've done less homework, I've done lesser quality work. You know, the more homework I do, the better the questions I ask. When I go into an interview knowing as much as the candidate does, then I'm going to have a certain amount of control over that interview. You know, I'm going to be in a position not to accept and tolerate inaccuracies and nonsense. You know, I can demand specifics because I already know where those specifics are, or have some idea. And doing your homework isn't, I mean, it sounds like but I mean, you know, I imagine all of you are already going to council meetings, you know. I mean, you already know, you probably know as much as, if you go to every bi-weekly council meeting, you probably, and pay attention and cover that with, you know, you probably know as much about the town as you need to know to go into this. But identify the issues, you know. I mean, what's at stake in this campaign, you know, and don't let the candidates necessarily, I mean, one of the worst things I see is some yeah, I hate to criticize, but, you know, certain hyper-local, you know, the extent of election coverage is publishing candidate statements, you know, basically letting candidates say what they think, what they want, basically letting candidates get their ads published for free, you know, and that's not what, you know, that's not what Jefferson had in mind, and the founders of this country had in mind. I mean, you know, we're not here to just regurgitate and be stenographers, you know. So you identify the issues. You know, what is the most important? You know, are the 3 most important issues the police layoffs, the question of what to do about the contaminated old industrial site behind the park, you know. The budget. Last year there was a 7% tax increase. You know, what are things that are going to affect your readers? You know, and again, we're hyper-local. I mean, it's almost a freeing. You know, we don't have to get into the big mindset of statewide issues and national issues. I mean, you know, that whether or not that park, that contaminated land becomes an extension of the park after they spend $2 million to clean it up, or whether it's just going to lay there fallow for the next 20 years, is going to affect your readers' lives, you know, in real, meaningful ways, you know. So you pick the issues. And frankly, you know, a lot of times people who do local election coverage just write one big election story. You know, here's what the candidate, this candidate says, and here's what this candidate says about these issues. You know, really, I've found I've done a better job when I've broken up, covering an election issue by issue, story by story. So you know, doing one story about public safety, you know. Okay, you know, Patterson had 125 police layoffs, and it's actually not going to be an election this fall. They're on a different calendar. But getting the candidates to say, okay, you know, are we willing to? And again, here's the important thing: crafting the questions. You know, if I go to my candidates and say, well, what do you think about the layoffs? I'm inviting them to overwhelm me with empty rhetoric. You know, layoffs are bad. You know, duh. You know, and you know what? he's going to say layoffs are bad, he's going to say layoffs are bad, and I'm not going to give my readers anything meaningful, you know? Because how do they pick it? If nobody likes layoffs and everybody likes public safety, you know what? I bet you not one candidate in the state is pro-crime, you know? I mean, I'll bet my life on it. So how do you ask the question, you know? And so I don't say, well, what do you think about the layoffs? I say, you know, would you be willing to increase taxes $3 million to rehire those police officers? You know, a very specific question that requires or begs for a very specific answer, you know? And so now they can't just say crime is bad, they have to say, you know, and you know what? 98% of your politicians, either because they're very skilled or they're very new at this. I mean, municipal politicians, we're dealing with a lot of people who are new at the game, you know? So for either extreme of the spectrum, they're still going to give you the crime is bad response. You know, their first response is going to still be rhetoric, you know? And here's where we become reporters and not stenographers, you know? Just because I asked a question and they said something after I asked a question doesn't mean they answered my question, you know? And Joe mentioned tape recorders, and this, you know, we have to listen. I have to listen to the responses I get from politicians, you know, people running for office. So that, and if they did not answer the question, they just gave me I have to re-ask the question, you know? And you see, and you know, and Joe talked about being professional, and it's really a matter of finesse, because, you know, sometimes, frankly, sometimes I can be kind of abrasive when I re-ask the question, you know, depending on what kind of mood I'm in, or depending on what my ongoing relationship is with the political figure, you know. I mean, but we try not to be, because, you know, it just helps the flow of information. But, you know, one of my stringers in Patterson one time, I gave him a set of, because he had been struggling with asking the right questions, so I gave him a set of questions, you know, and he came back and wrote the story and didn't really, and allowed the people he interviewed to be very general, you know. And he said, well, this is what they said, you know. And I said, you know, and the idea is we have to re-ask the question, you know, and you know what, it's not being rude. I mean, I really always take a kind of a corny mindset about this, you know, the old, you know, I'm up on the First Amendment soapbox, you know, at least in my mind when I approach these things, you know. And so, if you're running for office, and I ask you a question about whether you want to increase taxes or rehire police, you know, increase taxes or maintain the layoffs, and you don't want to answer that, how dare you? You know? You know, you're running for a public office with the public trust, overseeing the public money, and you don't want to say where you stand on an important issue in my city. And I don't need to say that to them abrasively in their face, but I need to have that confidence in my head and my heart, so that when they don't answer my question, you know, I can calmly ask it again. You know, I say, you know, excuse me, with all due respect, I'm confused. Could you clarify that, please? You know, I mean, you know, what did you really mean? You know, and this is with a tape recorder, you know, and Pat mentioned something, and you know, I'm like an old-time newspaper. I believe in newspapers, frankly, and the whole transition to the online news world is still a traumatic one for me, although I'm up to my you-know-what in it right now. But, you know, one of the things we can do, not only just tape recorders, but I mean, you know, the whole idea of taping an interview, like videotaping the interview. I mean, someone running for office whose quotes are only included in a, you know, as reporters, we tend to usually use the best quotes, you know? And so someone who really doesn't know what he's thinking, saying, or doing may actually sound semi-intelligent if we just pull the right quotes and use those in our articles. But if we can get the candidate to agree to a video interview, then bang, there's the emperor without his clothes, you know? And you know, and frankly, that's probably, you know, A, we're fulfilling our mission, and B, like, you're gonna get more hits on your site if the mayor looks like a stumbling idiot and 17 people, or, and I'm sorry, I don't even mean to dwell on a negative. I mean, you're going to get more hits with good video, and just frankly, that's the world of electronic. That's the electronic world, People love video, and I feel like somewhat of a hypocrite because our Patterson site is very poorly set up for that right now. But who knows? So that's homework. You demand the issues. You're not. We're not stenographers. And that's why another thing with the tape recorder. If I'm sometimes I found myself doing an interview and somebody's saying a lot and they really have some nice phrases that are being turned. I'm trying to take down a lot of notes, and I can get so caught up in taking down so many notes that I stop thinking. Big danger for me. If I'm worried about getting every quote, I have to. I'm very selective, and that's why a tape recorder is wonderful because you don't have to sweat that as much. You could put the tape recorder right out on a table and say, and most candidates, I think, wouldn't object, and if they do, you just explain, hey, I'm trying to make sure I get your words as accurately as possible, Frankly, and by law, you're not really required to put the tape recorder out on the table, but I mean, in this business, it's nice to be fully above board, So this way, I can listen to what they're saying, and when they're not answering my question, I could say, could you please clarify, what do you mean, details and facts. Demand details and facts, and you're going to be dealing with two sets of candidates. You're going to be dealing with incumbents and you're going to be dealing with challengers, I've probably 80% of the challengers who I've asked about an issue over the years probably tend to speak in vaguer, more general terms, more sweeping terms, Whatever the guy in there is doing now is wrong, that's not good enough. Okay, what would you do differently? What's your solution? What are your ideas? What's wrong about what he's doing? Can you explain the facts? Asking a challenger to explain the facts, and again, the common response to that is, well, I'm not in there, so I don't know it all yet. And at that point, you say, well, excuse me, but do you want me to say in my story that you want people's votes, but you really don't know the answers yet? Just as much as we're supposed to do homework, we can demand and expect, would-be, excuse me, not elected officials, but officials running for office to have done that homework as well, And Joe's right. I mean, we don't want to make these things, they shouldn't be antagonistic. But frankly, sometimes I get pissed off when someone's running for office and is giving me the runaround. I get more pissed off when someone's in office and is giving me the runaround. They have an obligation to talk to us because we represent the people. We are the way most people get their information about their budgets, about their municipalities. So again, we have the high moral ground. And we're not just some people just will treat us as, okay, we're just the media. No, think of yourself as a representative of you are the medium, and not just the media. You're the way people get this information. So do your homework. Don't be a stenographer. I mean, I try to do my homework. I try not to be a stenographer. Ask follow-up questions. Don't be afraid to ask the same question 4 times. And again, especially, I mean, imagine how. I mean, that would be a great video. If the person's not answering the same question, you keep asking, and you'd be doing your readers a service. I guess that's all I got.
First of all, I think it's a great tribute to Harry and Heather that they even invited me here, because I famously disagree with them about a lot of things, but we won't go there. I can remember as a kid, my grandfather sitting at the dining room table every morning with the local newspaper and reading it page by page, and the paper would carry a story about the city council, for which he had wonderful bilingual profanity. Then he'd turn the page and there was a story about the planning board, and he had even more bilingual profanity. And then there'd be one about the planning board and the school board, and his blood pressure and the level of his profanity would rise with each page. That world is so gone. I mean, I miss it because I loved sitting there watching. I didn't know. I was 8 or 9 years old and I had no idea what it was about. But The thing that always got him most was the Jersey Journal used to print the national debt on the first page in a little box every day. He should see the numbers today. That's gone, and you're the replacement. You are the successor to all that. I remember once asking an editor, a top guy at the Star-Ledger, saying, well, when you guys get rid of all of these people who know what they're doing, who's going to cover the planning board? And his answer, he didn't even hesitate. He said, nobody. And that shut me up. I had no answer to that. Obviously, you're filling that void. You are the first line of defense, and I think it's amazing that how many outlets have been able to flower in the wake of the I don't know, I guess it's a business decision, but really abrogation of responsibility on the part of newspapers. Well, you guys are the flowering. The big tree died, but all these little plants are growing up all over the place, and I think that's all to the better. Everybody's been talking here about interviewing candidates, interviewing currently elected officials when they are candidates for re-election. But there's another level to this, and to any municipal political scene, and that's the party leaders. Now, in some places, these people are, just appointees of the mayor or whoever. But in a lot of places, they're the power. Now, maybe my view is skewed by coming from Hudson County, where there are always murky, people in the background who don't hold any elective office who are very, very powerful. But I think that's true in a lot of places, a lot more places than Hudson County. And you got to know these people. You got to know who the party leaders are and need their input for whatever you're doing. But you can't understand local politics without them. And if you find out that they are irrelevant and that the mayor is the real power, that's fine. But if you find out that here's this guy behind the scenes pulling the strings, you need him. You need him. My favorite politician of all time is a guy named Rufus, who held no public office, either party or political, in upstate New York city. But he sat every day in a pancake house and held court. And judges, the mayor, I mean, everybody came to court Rufy's favor. And I don't know how he maintained this for over 30 years, but he did. And every mayor was beholden to him, every city council member was beholden to him, judges, and you'd go in there and his lunches would be these lavish tables with judges and politicians and civic leaders every day. I don't know that exists on that scale anymore, but some of these people hold a lot of sway. You got to get to know them. There's another dimension to all of this too, and that is the civic leaders, the people who keep the mechanism of government going, or politics going. The local, if there is one, the League of Women Voters. The local, every town has civic organizations that are trying to change things. Sometimes effectively, sometimes rather fecklessly, but you should know them and know where they stand on issues and be able to go to them for background information on just about anything. I love the idea of doing video on these things because, hey look, the governor, our current governor, is a genius at this. He has perfected the art of not the sound bite, but the video bite. I must get 2 or 3 of them a day from him. Some people are good at that, some people aren't good at that, but we should get them all used to it. We should get them all used to it because that's where the future is. The final element I want to talk about here is how desperate many of these local candidates are for outlets for their ideas. And you're it. You're it. And this is not to say that you have to become, as Joe put it, just a stenographer. But it costs huge amounts of money to run a campaign. And a lot of these people are underfunded. They don't have the money, particularly challengers, to mount a major effort against an incumbent. But you can provide them with an outlet to the people that they don't have to do mailers to, that they don't have to buy cable TV ads, or as many. You're performing a public service, and you're performing a political service as well. I hate to put it that way, but it's absolutely true. You're doing a service for them as well as for the public. And getting their ideas out. I mean, one of the problems in our politics is the power of incumbency. You can starve all challengers if they don't have the money to mount real campaigns. Nobody's ever going to hear what they have to say. You fill that void. You're filling a lot of voids here today. Questions for any of us?
Yeah, I'm Donohue from the Journalism and Media Studies Department here at Rutgers. And thank you all for coming. I'm really interested in finding out about hyperlocal news and how that's evolving and developing now. It's certainly something that I'll be teaching in my classes in new ways now, so I'm going to very carefully monitor this tape and maybe put a little bit of that online in one of my classes. I have a couple of questions. One is in regard to reporting on campaign financing. The biggest problem that I see among my students and the public in general is the view that they all do it. And therefore, how do we get, make it really relevant in terms of any one candidate that that person is doing it. And I would just like a little more guidance on what audience you're targeting when you write stories of that sort in order, because you always have to write any story for an audience. What is the audience? And who might respond? And what kind of response do you actually get to stories of that sort? And how relevant are they in this age of new media as opposed to older media, when everybody was seeing what was coming out in the Star Ledger or the Bergen Record? I have other questions, I guess, one in relation to civic leaders. I think that obviously is so very important. I think one of the characteristics of online media is that people like to see people. The whole thing is that it's not just leaders who are out there. It is a mediation process between people, your readers, your civic leaders, other people. And I'd just like to get more effective examples of how that might be done. In questioning, I'm just very impressed with the way you're all thinking about questioning. I just hope I can keep learning more about how you keep this in your mind, this idea that you do represent the people, and you do now, because of the availability of mass media.
Joe, you want to try that?
The question about why do you do this and who's the audience? I just saw the reporting on campaign finance issues as I was motivated by the same motivation I do of all journalism. You just want to have an impact if you can, and expose wrongdoing if you find it. Talk about. Not all campaign finance stories are like this, but I'll give you a dramatic example of one where it had a real impact. One day I'm reading, I think, the New York Daily News, and I saw that this, I forget, he was a businessman, was convicted of a felony. It came out that this guy was politically influential, and he had been convicted of a bank felony, basically committed bank fraud. And I saw the name, I said, well, wait a second. I went back and checked the ELECT database, and sure enough, he was a major donor to one of the state parties, and actually had bundled a lot of donations from a lot of different contributors. So I went to the state party chairman and said, well, what are you going to do about this? I mean, this guy's a convicted felon. You take money from convicted felons? The next day, they gave him back $14,000. That was the next day. We pursued that story further because I knew there was more there. I just had a gut feeling. And the irony of it is, the reporter who I worked on the latter part of the story with was Mike Druniak, who's now Governor Christie's press secretary. And Mike and Mike was a very good investigative reporter, was a great digger, and also a very good writer. And we uncovered the fact that not only did this guy have this, he was a convicted felon, he had also gotten a loan from the State Economic Development Authority. So, through his wife, to try to hide the bank felony. And in order to prove he was a convicted felon, and what scares me about today's journalism is that people don't have time to do things like this anymore. I actually went to a federal records office in Northeast Philly to dig out the record, to actually dig out like the 1987 conviction of this guy. I actually got the document because I couldn't get it online back then. It was like early 90s. And I actually went all the way down to this federal document storage area to get the actual document so I could prove. Anybody challenged me, here's a conviction. So we wrote about this and informed the Economic Development Authority. It was one of the few times they've ever pulled back a loan from a developer or a business owner. They actually said they canceled loan and made him, repay part of it. And as an epilogue, he went on in New York to get involved in a big scandal where they were actually giving donations in order to try to get, the man was Korean and it was a big, very influential in the Korean community. They were trying to get Koreans out of prison in New York State. And it was during the era of Governor Pataki. It became a major scandal. It was a major federal investigation. And this guy was a ringleader. The irony of it is, I think he eventually might have skated because I heard he might have been a CIA operative. He originally was from North Korea. So I heard he went between North and South Korea. So that's a really dramatic example, and a lot of them aren't that dramatic. Most of them aren't, but you can have an impact. I mean, one thing that Heather alluded to, and again, something that I wouldn't have the time to do now if I was still at the Ledger, and reporters don't have time to do, and maybe this is the void will be filled with other nonprofit groups or whatever. But I took all the contracts with all the state authorities, and this was when Harry was just starting to beat the drum about pay to play and raise the public awareness about this issue. His guys were developing the model legislation. So I said, why, the perfect ones to look at to test this are the state authorities. I mean, there's a lot of influence over these political influence. Let's check how much, money politicians are getting from contractors to these state authorities. So I literally spent about 6 months, and a lot of them. One of them I never even got a response, let alone any records, but I never got a response from them. There's a waterfront commission where like almost everybody went to jail later, so I didn't feel too bad. But I literally got the contracts from all 28 major state authorities, put all that data in a database, cross-referenced, took all the names of all the developers, I mean all the contractors, checked all their donations, cross-referenced all that and analyzed all that, and then did all the interviews and the writing. And then it was one of the first major pay-to-play stories that showed the influence. Like, all right, that at the time the administration gave out this, and this contract to this developer who gave out, this contractor who gave all this money. So, you can have an impact. I mean, to me, the audience, and especially when you cover the State House, is the legislature. You hopefully will get them to react. Hopefully can force action on things. So, and if the public gets, you can stir up, you want to, of course, stir up the public too if you can, especially if it's a local on a more local scale, you can try to mobilize the public on these issues. So that's a long-winded answer, but.
It's a wonderful and complete answer, and probably the makings for a book, especially about the fellow on bank fraud.
I love the story.
Anybody want to add anything to what Joe just said?
Your audience is the intelligent citizen, that's all. The reasonable, intelligent citizen, as it is for all journalism, for all writing, for all, any means of communication. I mean, there are obviously a large percentage of people who just aren't going to care. And they're not your audience. It's the people who care and who are smart enough to get it.
Okay, do we have another question down here or over there?
Hi, my name is Neil Coleman. My question is, how do we know that the hyper-local news is working? How do we measure it? There's obviously some great individuals putting, forth tremendous efforts, but replacing traditional historical newspaper investigative reporting, how do we know it's really happening? Is there a way to measure the number of hyper-local sites that exist? And do we measure that anybody goes to them? Is there real readership? Et cetera. So again, I'm a big supporter of this movement. I'm just not sure what the evidence is that we know it's working.
Since Joe Malanconico is the winner of the award for the best hyper-local in the state, I think he's the appropriate one to answer this.
And the way you phrase your question, you said, is it working? And we could probably spend 45 minutes to 3 hours just discussing how do you define whether or not a news entity is working? And is what the question of whether or not it's working defined by how many people read it, or what changes are brought about as a result of what it publishes, or some combination of all of those. And I think right now I think the answer is no one knows. I hate to sound like a politician, but it's a work in progress. And it's one that's I talk about this with Charlie Cradible all the time. I'd really in writing, in editing and writing much of Patterson Press, I'd really like to know why on one day we had 900 people come to our homepage, and another day it was 650. And sometimes it's clear. Sometimes it's clear when there's a story about. But sometimes it's not. I mean, sometimes last week was our biggest week in Patterson so far. We've been around for 11 months plus, and we had week-wide we had 5,200 hits on our homepage. That doesn't count individual hits to stories, etc. But that was our record week. And coming from the Star Ledger, where we had circulation of 430,000 at one point daily. Is it working? At the same time, there have been weeks when we've done stories. We did a story about police response to the schools after they used to have police working off duty in the schools. A month after that, I put in an open request to find out how many times now have police had to make calls to the schools and what they've had to make those calls for. We published that story, found there were like 430 something. Over a course of a month, 430-something visits to city schools by the police. X number were for assaults, X number were because of thefts, X number were just to check property, whatever. Within 10 days, the city council, the city administration, and the school board decided to put the off-duty cops back in the schools. No one ever said it was because these number of calls were highlighted, but I kind of think, but a few cops told me it was, So we are working in some instances, we're not working in others, and it's really a work in progress. I mean, that's kind of a. Yeah.
I'm going to be even more cynical. I'm going to be cynical about it. I'm going to say you never know.
Yeah.
You absolutely never know. I don't think the New York Times knows. I publish a small publication, and I put something out something that was really good. I can't wait to get the response, and the phone doesn't ring. Yeah, just sit there, but make a mistake. Oh, make a mistake, like put an extra zero on a number or delete a number. People go crazy. You're gonna hear from people about your errors. You're not gonna hear from people quite as much about how good you are. It's just the way life is. Human nature.
You You got a follow-up question?
I do.
Well, we told them follow-up questions are good.
Yes.
That's right.
You see the monster you created?
Let me rephrase.
Wants us to clarify.
To make it simpler, let's take away whether it's effective, but more, is it just plain growing? Now, again, I understand you have sort of superhero efforts in a couple individual places, but is it growing statewide so that it actually can replace the newspaper? And is the readership also growing? That we're having more sites and more people are reading the sites. Separate from the question of is it effective and do the readers do anything after they read it? So forget that question. Just, is this growing to the case where it's going to have some...
I think Heather has to answer that.
I would say absolutely. I mean, our site's 11 months old. I know some, they're in their infancy. Some of them, I mean, maybe the oldest one, they have BaristaNet is here. They're the example, and they've been growing, they're doing well, they're thriving. They're the two site in Montclair, and other sites are just blooming up, and they're 2 years old, so they still have time to grow. And Patrick said, I think in your statistics, each election, the people are getting information about elections online grows, and I think it's going to be an exponential growth as we go on, especially with the presidential coming up next year. More and more people are going to be going online to get their news and sharing on Facebook. I mean, it's a cross-pollination of social media. Newspapers can't connect with you as well as they're posting online. So that's my opinion.
Yeah, his numbers, I mean, he said 20, the most recent numbers, 21% of the people primarily got their news from the internet, and 28% from newspapers. And prior to that, I think the numbers were 2 or 4% from the internet. I know part of those are online, but Patterson Press, 8 months ago, when we had a week that we got close to 1,000, it was cause for celebration. We just had a week that's more than 5,000, and that's just homepage hits. I mean, you know, Patch.com I know measures it totally differently, where they count cumulative hits, including individual hits on individual stories, etc. And I think their average number of hits on an average is 10,000. You know, so yeah, it's clearly growing. You know.
Yeah, the bottom line deal is the readership is, wherever we track it, is growing rather rapidly. The fight for hyperlocals is to have advertising grow enough that they can stay in business and grow. And since they're new and people who buy advertising have to get familiar with them as a medium for advertising, especially in economic times like these, that's the challenge. But I think as that begins to shift, and it will, I think you're going to see them really come into fashion in a big way. Other questions? Yeah, Charlie.
Hey, everybody. I just wanted to ask a question. I know most towns have different types of governments and therefore different types of elections. So, as mentioned, some towns don't elect their mayor directly. I know in Patterson, their elections are going to be at a different time of year. They're also going to be nonpartisan elections. And I'm, of course, also interested in elections that play to different constituencies, towns that have a ward-based government. So how do you deal with those things in covering elections, and sort of what are some of the nuances about covering different types of town governments?
Well, first you have to understand what the system is. I mean, and maybe you got to go read the Faulkner Act and read the Walsh Act, which will explain the different forms of government in the state. I think the diversity of forms of government is a wonderful thing. A lot of people think we're crazy. I mean, people in Pennsylvania where they have all their elections are in even numbered years in November. Well, that's no fun. Nobody's having fun over there. I mean, we have an election every 6 weeks in New Jersey. That's the way you do it. Keep people, I'm joking, but I'm serious about it. You got to understand what the system is. You got to understand structurally how each of the different systems work. I grew up in the commission form of government, which only exists anymore in a handful of places. But I think it's fabulous. I mean, you vote for a 5-man ticket, and they each are the head of a department. They are both the executive and the legislature. That's really wild. There are places where you got direct election of mayor, strong mayor, weak council, mayor. You just have to go to the Faulkner Act and the Walsh Act and understand each one of them and what the PowerPoints are in each of those systems. I don't know how else wants to explain that.
I just want to add one point, because Nick actually touched on this before, but you have to realize that in a lot of towns, it's one thing to know the form of government, but then there's a political infrastructure around it. That's the tricky part, because that, a lot of times, you know, depending on how much political influence there is on that town, that, or school board, whatever it is, that's the part that's hard to trace and figure out and all. And that's, you know, sometimes you need to pay, and I think Nick made this point, you almost have to pay as much or more attention to that as you do to actually the mechanics of the government itself.
Yeah, I might have a follow-up question on that myself. My former life as a politician, I was having a chat one day with a labor leader. His name was Red, and he was deep in labor politics, and he saw that I was coming up, and he said to me, you know, Harry, you have to look for the string. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, every elected official, every politician has a string. It's usually on the top of their head. He said, and somebody is on the other end of that string.
Right.
Right. So my question to all of you is, how do you find out who's holding the string on each individual?
That's the hardest part of it all. That's the hardest part. Follow the money. Yeah. Follow the money. That'll tell you where some of the strings are. But if it's a political, you know, a behind-the-scenes political guy, that's going to become obvious after a while, because they tend to have been fixtures for a long time. I mean, you don't get a John V. Kenney or a Frank Hague. Well, Frank Hague was different. He was the mayor of Jersey City. But John V. Kenney wasn't anything. He wasn't the mayor. He wasn't the county Democratic leader. He wasn't anything. He was the boss. I hesitate to say that maybe George Norcross, never mind. Never mind. They're going to become obvious because they tend to have been there a long, long time. You don't accumulate that kind of power in 6 weeks.
Anybody else on how you find the string? Because that makes for interesting stories.
Well, I mean, what Joe talked about, I mean, Nick talked about following the money, you know, Joe's agency, you know, Middlesex County, for instance, you know, if you looked at the freeholder election forms, you know, all their money comes from, or at least it used to when I covered Middlesex County, all the money came from the Middlesex County Democratic Organization, right. You know? I mean, so, you know, go to your elected reports, and we haven't mentioned this, but, you know, we're talking about elected reports in the context of election coverage, but really, they're meat and potatoes information for your governmental coverage, you know, around the whole calendar. I mean, every contract that comes up and approved by your city council, you know, you should take. It's a beautiful thing now. You can do it in 2 minutes. Go on to elect and see. Okay, did this law firm donate money to the mayor? Did this law firm donate money to the city council? But you know, yeah, go ahead, John.
Well, it's easier to do it now because we're starting. Before 2 years ago, ELEC did not put local donations in a searchable database. But we're starting to do that now. We're a year behind because we have to actually get people to type in the data. But you can now start to search. There'll be a searchable database of donations that you can actually check. And that's really going to, as that builds up year after year, that's going to be really valuable. But I mean, I got a simpler piece of advice that's just sort of a general rule that I had as a reporter, and it served me well. And it can get a little expensive, so for a low-paid, hyper-local person, I don't know, you do the coffee part of it. But I had a rule. I would try to go out with a source, either lunch, breakfast, or dinner every week. So in answering Harry's question, how do you find out? You talk to people. And you build relationships with people on both sides of, I mean, one thing too I got to stress is like try to, you know, I don't know how you are politically, you know, in terms of your personal politics. But as a journalist, I still believe you got to be a neutral player. Like I always saw myself as a referee, and I would blow the whistle when either party had too sharp an elbow. But you know, I really tried over the years. I worked 1 year for the Corzine administration. I was in the Treasury Department for a year. But it was sort of a hiatus before I got to the job I'm at now, which is nonpartisan. But I mean, I'm a lifetime independent, and I've worked with both parties my whole life. And I think one of the secrets to my success was I dealt honestly with both parties. I mean, there were times when I'd have two party chairmen screaming to me about what a bastard the other one was and like telling me other information that, like, if I didn't have better ethics, I could have really played off each other. But I didn't do that. And you gotta respect the confidentiality and don't be political. I mean, don't get sucked into either party. Because what I found is they both, you know, and I'm not, I mean, even with all the people that have gone to prison, I've known many of them, that, you know, I still think the bulk of the elected officials in the state try to do a good job. Even as bad as it is today, and as cynical as we all feel about elected officials, I mean, you're not doing it. You're not the one sacrificing your time and energy and life force to be, you know, working for the public. So, you know, the fact that they put forth the and it's a sacrifice to perform public service. And so, I mean, I don't think actually most elected officials get the respect they deserve. So, like, I mean, have a certain respect. I mean, try to get that cynicism out of your mind a little bit. You know, like, and there might be times, like, if you deal with a real jerk, then you might have to amp it up a little bit. I mean, just because you got to be professional doesn't mean there's not times when you're, you know, you got to be more forceful in certain situations. You know, I mean, there's times when I had to push back pretty hard when people pushed at me. But anyway.
I want to underscore something Joe said. One of the things I discovered early on doing PolitiFacts is that there are no secrets within sub-communities of the political community. So that if you want to know, you know, randomly pick a county where one party is in control, the minority party knows what's going on. You want to know what secrets the mayor has. Talk to the guy who ran against him last time. You want to know what secrets the county chairman of the dominant party has. Talk to the county chairman of the other party. They tend to know because, you know, these are small communities, a couple of hundred people, and they all know each other. I found that works incredibly. I mean, as long as they're talking for background purposes, you're not going to, you know, not going to out them. You're going to find out an awful lot of interesting stuff about the people who are in charge. You can't always take it all, you know. There are a lot of axes to grind in this, but you're going to find out stuff you want to know.
While you're thinking of a few final questions, I want to underscore a few of the points that were just made. I think Nick makes a very good point, and you might even try to find, for example, the party committee person who is the committee person for the district in which the candidate lives. Ask that person what that candidate's like, what they know about them. The lower you go, the more likely they're going to talk openly, and you'll find out an awful lot that way. And I'll also underscore what Joe said about building relationships and taking people out to eat. Both Joe Melanconico and Joe Donohue covered me when I was an elected official, and I used to think they liked me, but I learned today they were just kind of warming me up and going to take me out to dinner and ply me with wine, and now I understand how he got everything.
One caveat, don't talk to former spouses. You're never going to get a straight answer.
We have another question here.
Hi, I'm Erica Blyberg with Baristanet. We have an interesting situation in Montclair, which is one of the primary areas of our coverage. And I just wondered if you had any experience with this before. Mayor of Montclair currently is trying to move the municipal elections to November. It's always been a separate election. And there's tremendous resistance, as with anything in Montclair. There's split council, a lot of anger, a lot of suspicion as to the motivation. His opponents believe that he's trying to prolong the term of the incumbents. Of course, they're denying that. So it now actually just Tuesday night, I believe it came to be voted down by the council, so that they're now threatening to bring it to a legal battle to allow it to get on the ballot. I'm not sure if I'm explaining, it's a little bit complicated, but I wondered if you had any experience. I think it's a fairly unusual situation.
It's also happening in Hoboken as we speak. And it's the stupidest argument. I mean, this is a fight for fighting's sake. Yeah, they're going to prolong their terms in office for 6 months. I mean, is that worth the aggravation? I mean, the argument for it is you're going to consolidate elections and save money, because elections cost money. I think if the guys in Montclair who proposed it, and the guys in Hoboken who proposed it, had considered the aggravation they were going to get, they would have never brought it up. I think it's a fight over nothing.
Well, they say it's to increase voter participation.
That's it. It saves money, increases participation.
Because you probably are going to get more turnout in November. Especially, I mean, turnout always fluctuates each November, whether there's a presidential race, if there's a U.S. senator in our ballot. So, even in November, it fluctuates. But in a presidential year, you get big turnout. So, and I would think that you probably you'd be more likely to get bigger turnout if people only had to go out once a year instead of twice a year.
Do you have any information on, one of the other concerns is that if you wrap it up into a national election, people aren't going to pay as much attention to the local politics, and that they're really not going to be as informed about the local candidates.
Yeah, because we really spend so much time and effort worrying about school board elections. The turnout is so high there that we wouldn't want to tamper with that.
One of the things that you want to look for in this, because it's happening more and more, it's the economy is driving it, because the principal argument used is going to be cheaper because we'll just have one election instead of two. But the municipal parties and the county parties are one, because the local municipal committee people are also by law county committee people. And when you have a nonpartisan election, there usually is less influence by the county party. When you move to November and have a partisan election, then the county party is going to have more influence. They're going to be running their candidates, so they're going to be more interested in the race. And they're more likely to put more money in, be more interested in who the candidates are from that town. That might even weigh upon the election of the county candidates and so on. So you want to look at that. In some of the towns that are shifting to the November elections, going from nonpartisan to partisan, they're actually discussing how to construct their ballots so as to keep their local candidates separate from the lines of the county candidates. So that's something you want to look into in Montclair. You can look at the Essex County Party and what influence would be brought in by going to a November election.
We only have time for one more question, and then we have Lee and Energy Spotlight. She's going to be giving a presentation. So, last question.
Yes, Patrick, you're entitled.
I'm going to just follow up on what you said. In some towns that some of you may be covering, you might be dealing with 5 elections. February, you have the primary, then April, you have the school district, May, nonpartisan town election, June, the primary, and then November, the general election. So it's something to keep in mind, looking at all those things. Nobody really covers the fire district elections, certainly, and the turnout for them is even lower than they are at 13% level for most school board elections. But one of the things that you should also be looking at, I don't know
Patrick, nothing in Hudson County could be more partisan because we don't have Republicans.
Fine, you hold it there.
There are 8 of them somewhere, but I don't know where.
All right, just by way of wrapping up then, if there are no other questions, I want to, on behalf of the Citizens Campaign, thank you all for coming.
I want to thank our panel. They were amazing as always.